James had always known the hard truth of life. There was no room for mistakes, no room for weakness. At 14, he was already helping his single mother, who worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. They lived in a rundown apartment in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, where opportunity seemed like a distant dream. But James wasn't discouraged. He was determined to make something of himself. He had seen enough people struggle, enough families sink deeper into poverty, and he didn't want to end up like that. It was a hot, muggy afternoon when everything began to change. James had just finished delivering groceries for Mrs. Pierce, an elderly neighbor, when he noticed a sleek black SUV parked on the side of the road. The car was beautiful, shiny, and expensive, something completely out of place in his neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of car that belonged here, and it certainly didn't belong to anyone James knew. He paused for a moment, wondering what the owner could possibly be doing in this part of town. Curiosity got the better of him, and he started walking closer. He noticed a man in a sharp suit, standing next to the car, looking frustrated. The man's face was tense, and he seemed to be on the phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. James took another step forward, trying to see if the man needed help. His mother always told him that offering help, even when it wasn't asked for, could sometimes lead to good things. And while James had no idea who this man was, he felt a strange pull to offer whatever assistance he could. "Excuse me, sir," James called out, his voice polite but a little shaky. "Looks like you've got some trouble with your car." The man on the phone glanced up at James, clearly surprised that anyone had approached him. He was about to wave him off when he saw the boy's worn clothes and the determination in his eyes. Instead, he raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, looks like I do. Flat tire. 2 of them, actually," the man replied, his tone frustrated. He hung up the phone and looked around, realizing that he was in a part of town where it was difficult to get help quickly. James didn't miss a beat. "I can help with that if you have a spare and a jack. I've changed tires before." The man studied him for a moment. James was thin, wearing faded jeans and an old T-shirt. His sneakers were scuffed, and his hair was messy, but his face held an expression of confidence that the man couldn't help but admire. He had no idea who this boy was, but something about his presence seemed genuine. "You know how to change 2 flat tires?" the man asked, almost skeptical. James nodded. "I've helped my mom with the car. It's not too hard. Just need the tools." The man seemed to hesitate, but then nodded. "All right, kid. If you think you can do it, go ahead." James's heart raced, but he didn't let it show. He got to work, retrieving the spare tires and tools from the back of the SUV. As he worked, the man watched him, impressed by how quickly and efficiently James handled the task. His hands were nimble, his movements precise. The boy didn't fumble or second-guess himself. He knew what he was doing. The hot sun beat down on James as he worked, but he didn't complain. It was a relief to focus on something other than the constant weight of his situation. The idea that he might be able to help someone, especially someone who could probably afford to pay anyone for help, made him feel good. He was doing something useful. After about 20 minutes, James had replaced both flat tires and tightened the lug nuts. He stood up, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and stepped back to survey his work. "There you go," James said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "All set." The man stood there, staring at James for a long moment. Then he broke into a slow smile, one of genuine admiration. "Well, kid, I'm impressed," the man said, extending his hand. "My name's Eric Donovan. You just saved me a lot of time, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it." James shook the man's hand, still trying to figure out if he really understood who he was talking to. Eric Donovan? That name didn't ring any bells. "It's no big deal, Mr. Donovan," James said, shrugging modestly. "Just doing what I can." Eric smiled again. "I like your attitude. Tell me, James, what's your story? What's a kid like you doing in this neighborhood?" James hesitated. He had grown used to people avoiding the topic of his life, to people assuming the worst about him and his family. But something about Eric's tone made him feel like he could open up. He took a deep breath and decided to tell the truth. "I live here with my mom. She works 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and I help out whenever I can," James said. "I'm just trying to make things better, for her and for me." Eric listened closely, nodding as James spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. When James finished, Eric was quiet for a moment, as if processing the words. "You're a good kid, James," Eric said finally. "I see a lot of potential in you. Most people would just walk by, but you didn't. You helped me, no questions asked. I think you've got something special." James felt a little uneasy. He didn't understand why this stranger was saying all these things, but the warmth in his voice made him feel good. "Thank you, sir," James said, trying to hide the growing sense of hope inside him. Maybe this wasn't just a random encounter. Maybe something bigger was coming. Eric looked at James with a thoughtful expression. "Tell you what, kid, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to offer you a deal. I run a company, and we could use someone with your work ethic. How would you like to come by and shadow me sometime? I'll see if I can teach you a few things." James's eyes widened in disbelief. "You want me to work with you?" Eric smiled again. "Not work exactly, but I can show you how things work in the business world. Give you a chance to see something different. What do you say?" James didn't have to think for long. This was a chance, a real chance. It wasn't a dream. It was right in front of him. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'd love that." "Great," Eric said. "Let's start with lunch tomorrow. I'll give you the address. We'll talk more then." James felt like his heart was going to burst. He had just changed a billionaire's tires, and now he was going to get the opportunity to learn from him. It was the kind of break he had been waiting for, the kind of break that only came once in a lifetime. Eric handed James a business card with his contact information on it. "Call me tomorrow, James. We'll make it happen." The next day, James woke up early, his heart pounding with anticipation. It was only 6:30 in the morning, but he had already been awake for hours, tossing and turning, thinking about the offer Eric Donovan had made. Was this real? Could a simple act of kindness really lead to a chance to change his life? After a quick breakfast of cereal, James grabbed his mother's old jacket. She wasn't around to stop him from borrowing it, and headed out the door. He called the number Eric had given him on the card and arranged to meet him at 12 p.m. It felt like the longest morning of his life. He was nervous, unsure of what to expect, but the promise of something better was enough to push him forward. The address Eric had provided led him to a part of the city he had never seen before. A clean, bright area filled with tall buildings and luxury cars parked along perfectly manicured streets. The contrast to his neighborhood was stark, and it made James feel like he had stepped into another world. He almost felt out of place, like he didn't belong, but he kept telling himself that this was his chance. This was his moment. When he arrived at the building, a sleek glass tower with the name Donovan Enterprises etched in gold above the entrance, James took a deep breath. He pushed open the door and was immediately greeted by a receptionist who directed him to the elevators. It all felt surreal, like he was living in someone else's life. As he stepped onto the elevator, the shiny buttons, the polished floors, it was all so different from the small, worn-down apartment he shared with his mother. As the elevator doors opened on the 23rd floor, James stepped out into a spacious, modern office. The walls were lined with contemporary art, and the floors were made of gleaming marble. The air smelled fresh, and everything seemed so clean and organized. He had never seen anything like it before. His eyes widened as he took it all in, trying not to look too awestruck. Eric was waiting for him by a large glass window that overlooked the city. He smiled when he saw James and motioned for him to come over. "Glad you could make it," he said warmly. "Let's sit down. I've got a few things I want to talk to you about." James nodded, trying his best to hide his nerves. Eric led him to a conference room where a spread of sandwiches and drinks had been set up. The room felt big, too big for just the two of them. But Eric didn't seem to mind. He gestured for James to sit across from him. As they settled in, Eric asked James more about his life. "Tell me about your family, James. You mentioned your mom works 2 jobs. What's that like?" James took a deep breath. He hadn't really talked about his life in detail with anyone before. It wasn't something he usually shared, but Eric had a way of making him feel comfortable, like his story was worth hearing. "My mom works as a housekeeper and at a diner. She's always tired, but she doesn't complain," James said, his voice quiet. "She works so hard. I try to help out by running errands or fixing things around the house, but it's tough. It's not easy." Eric listened intently, nodding. "It sounds like you've got a strong sense of responsibility. That's rare for someone your age." James shrugged. "It's just how things are. I can't just sit around and do nothing. My mom needs me." "You're a good son, James," Eric said, his voice sincere. "But you don't have to do it all on your own. I know it's hard, but there are opportunities out there for you, real opportunities, and I want to help you find them." James felt a surge of hope, but he kept his emotions in check. "How? I mean, I don't have the money for school, or I don't know the first thing about business or anything." Eric leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "That's where I come in. I'm going to help you. First, we'll start with some training. I'll introduce you to the basics of running a business, managing finances, and dealing with clients. If you put in the work, I can guarantee you'll learn a lot. And who knows, you might find a field you're passionate about." James felt a knot in his stomach. This was more than he had ever dreamed. The idea of being mentored by someone like Eric, someone with experience and success, felt like a lifeline. He could already see the possibilities in his mind, the hope for a future where he didn't have to struggle just to survive. Eric smiled as if he could read James's thoughts. "We'll take it one step at a time, James. But first, I want to do something for you and your mom. I know your living situation isn't ideal. So I've arranged for you to get a new home, one that's comfortable and safe. It's the least I can do after the kindness you showed me." James blinked, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Wait, what? You're going to buy us a house?" Eric nodded. "Not just any house, a place where you and your mom can start fresh. A place where you don't have to worry about your roof leaking or your windows not closing properly. I'll take care of it." James was speechless. The words felt unreal, like they didn't belong in his world, but as he looked into Eric's eyes, he saw nothing but sincerity. "Thank you," James finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Eric smiled, clearly pleased. "You've earned it, James. Now, let's talk about the future. I'm going to get you started with some training at Donovan Enterprises. We'll begin with shadowing some of our top managers. You'll learn from the best." James could hardly believe it. Just days ago, he was helping a man with flat tires on the side of the road. Now he was being offered a chance to change his life in ways he never imagined. The following week, James stepped into Donovan Enterprises for the first time. The building felt even more intimidating from the inside. The walls were lined with framed awards, and the floor was polished to a mirror shine. The hum of activity was constant, with employees typing on computers, answering phones, and having discussions. It all felt so overwhelming, like a world James had never even imagined. Eric had made arrangements for James to shadow a few of his top managers. Today, he was going to meet Mrs. Lawson, a senior executive who managed several projects for the company. She was a tall woman with short, dark hair and sharp eyes. She greeted James with a firm handshake and gave him a smile that was both welcoming and professional. "James, it's good to meet you," Mrs. Lawson said, her voice calm but authoritative. "I'll show you what we do around here. Let's start with a tour of the office, and then we'll jump into some of the basics of project management." As they walked through the office, James tried to take everything in. He saw how people worked together in teams, how they communicated through technology, and how the company kept everything running smoothly. It was a far cry from the small neighborhood he was used to. There was a sense of order here, of purpose, something James hadn't fully understood before. Mrs. Lawson explained the different departments, how each one had its own role in the company's success. In project management, we keep everything organized, she said. We make sure that deadlines are met, budgets are adhered to, and that communication flows smoothly between teams. It's a lot of responsibility, but it's rewarding. James listened intently, taking notes in his phone. He had never thought about business in such a detailed way. It was fascinating how much planning and coordination went into running a company like Donovan Enterprises. After the tour, Mrs. Lawson sat down with James to explain the next part of his training: budgeting. A huge part of any project is knowing how to manage the finances. Without a budget, nothing gets done, she said. She gave him a simple project to work on, calculating expenses and creating a budget for a mock event the company was planning. At first, the numbers made James dizzy. He wasn't used to doing math this complicated. But Mrs. Lawson was patient with him, walking him through the steps and helping him understand each part of the process. James worked through the budget carefully, asking questions when he was confused. He quickly realized that this wasn't just about crunching numbers. It was about planning for the future, making sure resources were used wisely, and preventing mistakes. By the end of the day, James had completed the budget. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He could see the logic behind it now, how small decisions could make a huge impact on the success of a project. "Good work today," Mrs. Lawson said, smiling as she looked over his work. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Keep up the effort, and you'll pick up the rest quickly." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. A compliment from someone like Mrs. Lawson? It felt like a validation of everything he had hoped for. He was learning, growing, and it felt like the first real step toward something bigger. The next few days followed the same pattern. James shadowed different managers, learning new skills, how to communicate effectively, how to handle clients, and how to stay organized under pressure. Each lesson built on the last, and James's confidence grew with each new challenge. He even started to understand the language of business, picking up terms and strategies he had never heard before. By the end of his first week, James was exhausted, but exhilarated. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the path to something greater than what he had ever known. One afternoon, as James was leaving the office, Eric caught him by the elevator. "How's it going, James?" he asked, a grin on his face. "It's amazing," James replied. "I never realized how much goes into running a company. I feel like I'm learning so much every day." Eric nodded. "I'm glad to hear it. And remember, this is just the beginning. We'll continue to build on what you've learned, and soon you'll be ready to take on more responsibility." James couldn't stop the smile from spreading across his face. A few weeks ago, he had been just a boy from a small neighborhood, helping a man with flat tires. Now he was sitting in the offices of one of the most successful companies in the city, learning skills that could change his life forever. But Eric's help didn't stop there. He had arranged for James and his mom to move into a brand new house, a place with enough space to breathe, where they didn't have to worry about repairs or bills piling up. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a fresh start, and it meant everything to James. As they settled into their new home, James realized just how much Eric had done for him, without asking for anything in return. He had given James not only the opportunity to learn, but the chance to create a future where anything was possible. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," James whispered to himself as he looked out the window at the city skyline, feeling like he had finally found his place in it. As the weeks passed, James began to settle into his new routine at Donovan Enterprises. His life had completely transformed. Since that day he helped Eric with the flat tires. The tasks that had once seemed daunting now felt more like challenges to conquer. Every morning he woke up excited to learn something new, eager to absorb everything that Eric and the other managers had to teach him. The training at the company was intense but rewarding. James spent his days shadowing different departments: marketing, customer relations, and even the finance team. He saw firsthand how each part of the company worked together to keep things running smoothly. It was like watching a giant, well-oiled machine at work, and for the first time in his life, James felt like he could be a part of something much bigger than himself. But it wasn't just the business lessons that were changing him. James was beginning to change on a personal level, too. He was more confident now. He spoke up in meetings, asked questions, and contributed ideas. Eric had a way of encouraging him without pushing him too hard, allowing James to find his own voice and develop his own strengths. One afternoon, as they were working through a project proposal, Eric pulled James aside. They were standing by a window that overlooked the city, the sun casting long shadows across the office floor. "You're doing well, James," Eric said, his voice quiet but firm. "You've picked up on things faster than I expected, but I think you're ready for something more." James turned to Eric, a little nervous. "What do you mean?" Eric gave him a knowing look. "I mean, I want you to take on a project of your own. It's going to be a big step, but I believe you can handle it. You've been learning about how we run things here. Now it's time to put that knowledge to the test." James's heart raced. A project of his own? This was the kind of opportunity he had only dreamed of, and it seemed like it had come out of nowhere. "What kind of project?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I want you to lead a small team to organize an upcoming charity event," Eric explained. "It's something our company does every year, but this time I want you to take charge of the planning. You'll be responsible for everything: logistics, budget, organizing volunteers, and ensuring the event goes smoothly. I'm confident that you can do it." James blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Lead a team? Me?" Eric smiled. "Yes, you. I've seen the way you've taken initiative here. This will help you grow in ways you can't imagine. You've earned it, James." The weight of the responsibility hit James almost immediately. He had never led a group before, let alone organized an event, but he knew this was his moment. It was a chance to prove not only to Eric, but to himself, that he could rise to the challenge. "I won't let you down," James said, his voice full of determination. Eric clapped him on the shoulder. "I know you won't. I'll be here to support you, but this is your project. You're ready." Over the next few days, James threw himself into the planning. He started by creating a timeline for the event, then worked with the marketing team to design flyers and social media posts to promote the charity. He reached out to local vendors to arrange for food and entertainment, making sure that the event stayed within budget. The task was daunting, but James felt a sense of pride with every step he took. The team he had been assigned to were supportive and eager to help. At first, James felt unsure of himself, but as the project progressed, he grew more comfortable in his role as the leader. He found his voice, gave clear instructions, and made sure everyone was on track. By the time the event was just a week away, everything was coming together perfectly. But even as things seemed to fall into place, James felt the pressure building. He was nervous. What if something went wrong? What if he wasn't good enough to pull it off? The night before the event, James stayed late at the office, going over every detail. Eric found him there, hunched over a pile of papers, looking tired but focused. "How's it going?" Eric asked, his tone casual but full of concern. James looked up, trying to mask his nerves. "It's almost done. I just want to make sure everything's perfect." Eric smiled. "You've done the hard part already, James. Now you just need to trust yourself. You've been trained well, and you've put in the work. Everything will fall into place." James nodded, taking a deep breath. Eric's words gave him the reassurance he needed. Tomorrow was going to be a big day, but he was ready for it. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had the tools to succeed. The day of the charity event had finally arrived. James stood backstage, watching the preparations unfold in front of him. Volunteers were setting up tables, arranging decorations, and testing the sound system. The venue was buzzing with activity, and everything seemed to be running smoothly. But underneath his calm exterior, James's heart raced. This was his project, and the pressure of everything resting on his shoulders was overwhelming. He glanced at the clock, an hour until the event was set to begin. His mind raced through the final checklist. Guests had confirmed their attendance, the catering was ready, and the fundraising goals had been set. Everything had been carefully planned, but there were still 1,000 things that could go wrong. James couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. Just as he was about to check in with the catering team, Eric walked over, a calm smile on his face. "You're doing great, James," Eric said, his voice steady. "Everything looks fantastic." James gave him a nervous smile. "I hope so. There's so much riding on this. I've never done something like this before." Eric nodded thoughtfully. "I know it's a big step, but I've seen you grow over the past few weeks. This event is proof of how far you've come. Just remember, lead with confidence and trust the team you've put together. They're here to support you." James took a deep breath, absorbing Eric's words. He looked around the room at the volunteers and staff, all of whom had been working tirelessly to make this event a success. It wasn't just his responsibility anymore. It was the collective effort of everyone involved. And James had learned that leadership wasn't about doing everything himself. It was about trusting others and working together toward a common goal. The event kicked off with a speech from Eric thanking everyone for their time and support. Then James took the stage. His hands were shaking slightly as he approached the microphone, but he could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. He had spent so much time working on the details that he hadn't thought much about this moment. But now, as he stood in front of everyone, he realized how much it meant to him. "Good evening, everyone," James began, his voice slightly shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "Thank you for being here tonight. This event is about more than just raising money. It's about community, about coming together to support each other. I'm honored to be here with all of you, and I hope you enjoy the evening." The crowd applauded, and James felt a rush of pride. His nerves melted away as he realized that he was doing this. He was leading, he was making a difference, and he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. The event went off without a hitch. The food was delicious, the entertainment was a hit, and most importantly, the fundraising goals were exceeded. By the end of the night, James was exhausted but exhilarated. The energy in the room was palpable as people mingled and celebrated the success of the evening. Eric approached him again, this time with a proud smile. "You did it, James," Eric said, shaking his hand. "You led this event to success. You handled everything with grace under pressure." James smiled back, a sense of accomplishment flooding through him. "I couldn't have done it without the team. Everyone worked so hard." Eric nodded. "That's the mark of a great leader. You understand that it's not about doing it all yourself. It's about bringing people together, inspiring them, and guiding them toward a common goal. You've got that skill, James. I'm proud of you." James felt a deep sense of gratitude. He couldn't have imagined, just a few months ago, that he would be standing here, hearing these words from Eric. The boy who had once been lost in a neighborhood full of struggles was now a leader in his own right, ready to tackle even bigger challenges. As the night wound down, James stepped outside for a moment of quiet. He looked up at the city skyline, his mind racing with everything that had happened. The old life, the life of struggle and uncertainty, felt like a distant memory. He had come so far in such a short amount of time, and it was all because of that one moment when he decided to help a stranger, with flat tires. James realized that this wasn't just about the charity event. This was about the future he had carved out for himself. Eric had shown him what was possible, but it was James who had put in the hard work, the determination, and the drive to change his life. As the last guests began to leave, James found his mom waiting for him by the exit. She had attended the event, though she had stayed in the background, quietly observing her son's transformation. She walked over, her eyes filled with pride. "I'm so proud of you, James," she said, hugging him tightly. "I never imagined you'd be doing something like this." James smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Neither did I, Mom, but it's just the beginning." As they walked home together, the world felt different. The streets were the same, the buildings still worn and familiar, but James no longer felt small in them. He had found his place, and with hard work, determination, and the belief that anything was possible, he knew that his future was bright, and it was just beginning. Thank you for following James's journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring tales of growth, leadership, and resilience, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for future adventures. Your support means the world. Let's continue to inspire each other and reach new heights together.